So hey everybody, my name's Graeme. I'm the director of the DNS Abuse Institute, and I'm going to tell you a bit about that. We're going to talk about DNS abuse and online harms over the next 45 or so, and we'll have some room for questions. A bit about me, just so you guys have some more context. As Glenn was just saying, boy, we're almost 20 years, 20 years ago now, I was actually the first citizen lab employee back in the day at the University of Toronto during my undergrad. And that's sort of where I really got engaged in politics and technology. Spent some time doing some other things. And then for the past 10 or 11 years or so, have been working in I work for a large registrar based out of Toronto, Canada called Two Cows, and was doing public policy and internet governance issues for Two Cows. 4 of those years, I was chair of the registrar stakeholder group inside of ICANN, worked a lot on DNS abuse issues in that time as well. And then relatively recently, within the past 6 weeks or so, I left Two Cows to join the DNS Abuse Institute, which was created by Public Interest Registry, who run .org, to get that off the ground and running. Today, we are going to talk a little bit about the Institute itself, and so I'll do a bit of an introduction there. And then sort of on the premise that I don't want to tell you guys how to think about things, because this is a school in a sense. What I want to do is try and give you some tools about how to think about some online harms. And so that's what I'm going to try and accomplish today. And I will say that this is pretty rough. This approach is really something I'm experimenting with. So I think we're all going to be learning together, and I hope that's gently interesting for you. And I'm hopeful that your conversations will help me, or questions and conversation will help me refine this sort of methodology, this framework I'm thinking about. Yeah, so that's what we're going to talk about today. Right. So we're going to come back to the definition of DNS abuse in a sec. So this is maybe gently out of order for some people, but we'll get there. Bear with me. Why was this why questions about the formation of the DNS Abuse Institute? Why did we need a new organization to try and tackle this specific type of online harms? And the answer is a couple of these points here, which is there's clearly this DNS abuse and online harms are a topic of concern within the ICANN and internet governance community. We see a lot of conversation about this over the past couple of years. It seems to be sustained, and it is reflected by an underlying reality that there are a substantial amount of online harms. And there has been historically no organization with a mandate to address this issue. Or at least not within the, let's call it the DNS specific space. And that's, the internet governance as a whole is your school, but, and DNS is just one piece of that, but it tends to be where a lot of the conversation is. And the DNS is a curious beast. And we have lots of commercial players with their own self-interests. But there isn't an organization operating, or there hasn't been until now, an organization operating to try and improve this situation across the entire industry. And so that's one of the reasons why the DNS Abuse Institute was created. And there's some real interesting quirks about the way the DNS industry works that hasn't really enabled strong collaboration. Domain registration is a very high volume, low margin business, which means you're selling lots of domain names for very little money. I think on average you make $1 or $2 a year per domain name. And so that doesn't lend itself to spending lots of time looking at those domain names and building tools and resources to combat abuse. And in the context of a very low margin industry, players are often really strongly competing for business. And so you really want to make sure you've got the lowest prices. And it also means that because you're competing so much with with the rest of the industry doesn't lend itself to cooperation. So where interests align on doing things like collaborating against online abuse, you don't have necessarily strong relationships with each other that you can begin to build best practices. And so the creation of standalone institute with a bit of separation from that competition is one of the reasons that I exist, or this institute exists. PIR, Public Interest Registry, who run .org, decided to create this institute for a couple of reasons. One is they are a public interest registry. They have a mission to serve the public interest. They're a not-for-profit. And if you look at how they serve the public interest, it's part of that is making sure that the internet is maximally enabling. And the way they can enforce that is ensuring that people have trust in the internet, that it's a safe space to do and create. And so that really aligns with their mission. The Public Interest Registry is also a key player in something called the Framework to Address Abuse, also known as the DNS Abuse Framework. If you Google that, I'll find a link if I have a moment. And so when I was working for a registrar, I helped write this thing too, and so it's building on that work. I can see Bill in the chat is saying opportunities for DNS abuse is a great way to boost sales. There is some controversy about that particular point. Having worked for a registrar, the economics on that are very bad. And so I think it is somewhat difficult to actually build a business on explicitly trying to get bad actors on your platform. Alpnames, which was a registrar that collapsed probably 2 years ago now, and was widely regarded as and clearly the worst in the industry. They had lots of abuse on their platform. Their economics fell apart, and that's partly because, and I don't have this slide in my presentation, but it would be good to show the renewal rate economics are such that if you're offering discounts in the first year, you're really discounting to attract business. And that business is poor, in which it has a low renewal rate, you're not going to make money on those domain names. And the bulk of money is made within the registrar business on renewals. It's not new business. So it's really difficult, I think, to build a business exclusively on or predominantly on, let's call it bad faith or harmful registrations. Right, so that's the why of the DNS Abuse Institute. The Institute's got 3 pillars that we're going to be working on. That's going to be education, collaboration, and innovation. The education piece is really important. This is one of the gaps that I've seen in the industry, is that registrars and registries, many of them are small. You can start a registrar with just 1 or 2 people. And you can manage hundreds of thousands or even millions of names with a very small team. And they don't necessarily have a lot of time and energy, capacity to go around researching and understanding from a diverse array of sources what DNS abuse is and how to mitigate it. And so we're going to be really focused on building those resources, having great best practices, ensure those are translated into multiple languages and available for registries and registrars who will do that mitigation. There's also a bunch of work that we need to do on education for people who would submit or create abuse reports, intellectual property, law enforcement, cybersecurity, people like that who are submitting abuse complaints to registrars, where they need to understand if a registry or registrar is the best place to address that type of abuse. What information they should be submitting, what the timelines they can expect are, what the format should be. There's a lot of work to be done there. Collaboration is a fun one. This is really bringing people together to have the sort of tough discussions that we need to have around DNS abuse. We tend to be a little bit focused, especially within the ICANN sphere, which is where I've spent most of my time, on just generic top-level domains, so like .net, and not country codes like .ca or .de. And so we need to be a little bit broader when we're tackling DNS abuse. We need to be talking to hosting companies. We need to be talking to cloud providers. We need to be talking to the content delivery networks. We need to be talking to CCTLDs. And so the conversation needs to be a bit bigger than it has been historically. And that's really going to be something that the Institute is going to be focused on. The last one, that innovation, this is the bit about the Institute that really got me excited and got it, me to join the Institute, which is we have lots of opportunities within the internet governance space to talk and debate and discuss. That happens endlessly in ICANN and the IGF. But really, one of the key bits of the Institute is that we need to move from talk to action. And so this is where we're going to be doing things like funding research and actually building tools for registrars and registries to help mitigate DNS abuse, and tools for abuse reporters to ensure that they're able to do that effectively. And so what does that look like? That could look like, I think one of the things we're going to, and I haven't finished my roadmap, so this is all a little bit up in the air, centralized abuse reporting tool, so that there's one website where anyone can go and you plunk in the domain name and it does a whois or RDAP lookup to see which registrar that's with. And you can select the type of harm that you think that is, and it tells you what information you need, and it collects all that information and sends it to the right party. People who are submitting abuse complaints are often frustrated that they don't know where to go and how to submit abuse. And so smoothing the rough edges out of that, providing one centralized place, I think is going to be a really powerful project. So that's one thing we're really thinking about doing. I think we need to get better at understanding the key tools for mitigating abuse for registries and registrars. Those tools are primarily what are called RBLs, reputation block lists. There's a lot of them out there. They vary in quality substantially. And in order for a registry or registrar to act on abuse, they need some sort of evidence because they may have liability. And this is like a key piece of the whole puzzle. Ensuring that registrars and registries get timely abuse reports that are well evidenced, that they can act on, and they feel comfortable that they have enough protection against, the liability of turning off a domain name, is really important. So we're going to be looking at these RBLs. It could be education about which ones are best. It could be looking at how to aggregate them into a single useful RBL. There's lots to be done here. I can see Alfredo has a question in the chat. Do you see the Institute as a gatekeeper and establishing some policies or framework for ICANN and RIRs? So I think policies is probably a strong word. We don't have any mechanism to force people to do anything. So it's really going to be about sharing voluntary best practices and getting people on board that way. So I would say we have more carrots than sticks, if that makes sense. I will also say that as I'm building our roadmap for how we want to tackle online harms, where I'm spending my energy, or what I'm really thinking about is going to be the most effective, is providing tools and resources to frontline compliance and anti-abuse teams. Those are the people, in front of computers, assessing abuse complaints as they come in and deciding whether to take a domain off the internet or not. And the reason I think that that is the best place to start is that for them to integrate new information and new tools is quite easy. There are more proactive things that we could be doing to mitigate abuse before it happens. So that could be, machine learning models where if someone registers a domain name that has a -com in it, which is common in phishing, for example, or someone is registering 1,000 domain names at a time, that you then introduce some friction into that registration process. So maybe it requires an extra level of verification. Maybe the domain doesn't resolve right away. There are things like that that I think could be really effective for mitigating abuse. But, and this is really key, registrars typically have a long backlog of work that they're working on, and getting code written that doesn't generate new revenue or keep a platform operating is difficult. And the reality tends to be that the industry is consolidating. And so we see sort of less and less registrars. We have sort of fewer big ones. We have fewer registrars and more big registrars. Most of those platforms that those registrars are operating are pretty old, like I would say mid 2000s. Bits and pieces, are newer than that, but they're often like pretty clunky old systems. And so really trying to get people to build tools and resources that require integration into those platforms is a huge amount of work. And I think there are opportunities there, but my personal sense is the low-hanging fruit, the way to make the internet safer, faster, is to give the tools and resources to the people who are actually combating abuse. All right, so I think that's sort of the key pillars of the Institute and how I'm thinking about it. I think I just talked to this quite a bit about my initial focus. Maximum impact with least implementation would be a really good way of summarizing what I was just saying. Right, and I've already talked about all these things. I front run my slides, sorry guys. That standardized abuse reporting is going to be really key. We need to understand the tools and building blocks that the industry needs, and we really need to focus on resources and tools that do not require technical integration. Yeah. To Kathy's question in the chat about the consolidation of registrars, I don't know that it's a concern for registrars. For some it's an opportunity where they've built a sizable registrar business and they want to exit. They built the business and they want to give it to someone else or sell it to someone else for a bunch of money, and that's okay. The thing about the high volume, low margin domain business is that it's a business of scale. And so the economics of being a registrar of for instance, an ICANN accredited registrar really only makes sense once you have a certain amount of names. So I'm going to be sort of making this math up off the top of my head. But let's say you're making $2 a name a year and you need an engineer to run your platform. Well, in Toronto, a junior engineer is going to cost you about $80,000 a year. So you need 40,000 domain names to renew every year or new to pay for a single engineer. Well, that's a lot of names. Like, how do you get that scale quickly? It's really tricky to do. And so you can see very quickly, as soon as you're trying to operate a business and you need like 3 or 4 people, you need like, a business guy, an engineer or 2, and some support. You need hundreds of thousands of domain names for that business to make any sense. Typically, the path is you start as a reseller where you're not directly accredited with ICANN, and you're reselling through large wholesale registrars like Tucows, which is the company I used to work for, Real Time Register, Central NIC, through Key Systems. I think GoDaddy has one called Wild West Domains. So you become a reseller, you sell domains without being directly accredited. You get enough scale then that you can begin directly accrediting for like com and net. You wouldn't necessarily do, I should say org2, because they've sponsored the internet, the Abuse Institute. And so you would accredit individually with these TLDs as you grow your scale and it becomes a more viable business. I think there is some concern, not necessarily around that consolidation, but around the shrinking difference between registry and registrar interests, as there's more and more vertical alignment as registries and registrars get closer together in some sense. And so that, I think, is driving some concern, where there are still differences in interest between those two groups. To Kathy's point again in the chat, is it then a concern for registrants? Because I agree the telecom ISP issue in Canada is a disaster, and the government should not let the mergers happen anymore. We just don't have enough diversity in the space. There's about 2,100 ICANN accredited registrars. They belong to about 400 registrar families, so companies that own multiple creds. I think that's still plenty of diversity at the moment. 400 is quite a lot. There's going to be someone offering what you need at that point. Will we get to a place where there is not enough diversity? Maybe. It's worth thinking about, where there is, like, the top 20 or so registrars are, 85% of the market. Is that a problem? Maybe. I'm not an economist, though, so it's maybe worth thinking about a bit more. All right. Okay. I've been talking too much because there's some really meaty stuff I want to get into. DNS abuse has a definition, and this is the definition adopted by the contracted party house within ICANN. It is malware, farming, phishing, botnets, and spam only where it's a vehicle for those other harms. These are technical harms that are exploiting or using primarily the services provided by registries and registrars. This definition comes from a couple places. Work from the Internet and Jurisdiction Project, which is, they do some great work, and they just launched some new toolkits. Please check those out. This definition is also from the Framework to Address Abuse. It's also not intended to encompass all harms that registries and registrars see. There are other things that happen that are bad that registries and registrars should deal with, child sexual abuse materials being the most obvious example. The Institute is not saying you shouldn't do those things. Please go deal with those harms. It's just that those are not the harms that the Institute is focused on solving. Right. So how do we get to this definition? And this is controversial is maybe the wrong word, but a strong topic of debate within the community as people want to expand that definition of what DNS abuse is, or have registrars and registries be responsible for other online harms. And so this gets into the meaty bit that I've been thinking about quite a bit as part of my job, and really what I wanted to discuss with you 20 minutes in. Because I think this is sort of an interesting discussion, and we need to have a more structured conversation about how to mitigate online harms and where to do so. So bear with me. This is a little bit rough as I'm still working through these ideas, and hopefully this is interesting to you guys too. So there are lots of bad things on the internet. I put those into three broad categories. There are content harms. So that's going to be things like transgressive content. That could be, transgressive is obviously for your own definition of transgressive, could be hate speech, could be anti-democratic content, things like that. There's also intellectual property issues, so piracy, trademark, and copyright infringement. And then there's financial and commercial harms, things like fraud, scams online. Those are all sort of fitting into the content harms. So those are things that happen on web pages. There are technical harms, things like botnets, and that's where computers have been taken over. They have some sort of centralized control, and they're used to do DDoS and other harmful things. There is malware and the distribution of malware. That malware is to compromise computers, maybe used to steal information, used to create more botnets, used to do things like ransomware. There's farming, which is a type of DNS hijacking. And then there's sort of hybrid harms, where it's some combination of technical and content. Phishing, for example, might use a domain name which looks like a bank, but it's really the web page itself that is trying to steal credentials, whereas the content piece. And so it's using both. And these distinctions between these different harms, especially the technical and hybrid, there are some gray areas as they move from just technical pieces and into content. And there's a lot of discussion about those bits. So that's sort of a broad list of the bad things that happen on the internet. And here is a bad graphic that I have made that's hopefully understandable. This is sort of a map of all the intermediaries on the internet. The user could be you. The content could be me right now. It looks to me like I'm at this whole session we're in at this moment is hosted at blindsidenetworks.com. So this is the content. And there are lots of pieces between you guys and the content. There's your ISP. There could be a content distribution network, something like Cloudflare, that ensures content is available across the whole internet. There is the web host, which is the hosting company behind this. It could also be a cloud services provider like Amazon. Could be it's a content platform that could be like Facebook or Twitter or Reddit. And then there's the actual content itself. There's a whole addressing component to this as well. There could be a separate DNS provider if you don't use your ISP's DNS. I don't use my ISP's DNS because I don't trust them so much, and so I use one that's better for privacy. There's the domain registry and domain registrar. So blindsidenetworks.com was registered somewhere, and it's a .com, so it's using VeriSign. Could be a domain reseller in there as well, and a registrant who owns the domain name. So those are sort of all those pieces in between any given user and a piece of content. So that is a map of the internet that I want to make sure that you guys have in your head a little bit as we move forward, because it's a building block for this next piece, which is different harms use different infrastructure in different ways. So let's say there's a death threat on Twitter, and I apologize to Twitter for using them as an example. It could have been on Facebook or on Reddit or any of the other large content platforms. The red box is where that harm is, or is the piece that's integral to the harm is sort of how I'm framing it. Okay, so that's relatively straightforward. That's a content harm. Twitter is still twitter.com, so it's still using a registry and a registrar. Their content is hosted, or, exists in probably a cloud service provider somewhere. You're still accessing it via an ISP. All of these pieces of the internet are still in play. But the primary harm is integral to that platform. Let's try another example. A botnet. So botnets use these command and control systems that typically use something called algorithmically generated domain names, where there's a whole bunch of domain names that may or may not be registered. They're used for a very brief period of time to organize control of these botnets. So again, the whole ecosystem is in play, but the key bit of the harm is where the command and control is being hosted, and typically the registry, because all of these domain names may or may not exist. And if they don't exist yet, they haven't been registered, it's really the registry that has the power to prevent them from being used. So you can see that while there is the harmful content, which is what the botnet is using to control stuff, it's the host and the domain registry in this example that are integral to that online harm. To David's question in the chat, it's both, but often they don't use. People who investigate botnets will discover that the algorithm for generating domain names, and so they know these domain names ahead of time. The host is the source of the harm, but the benefit of using domain names is that they can change the host very easily. And so you can point your domain name at any number of hosts and change that very rapidly. And that's one of the reasons why the registry is integral to a botnet harm and not just where the host is. Because you could get that particular host taken down, but you can use your domain name to point at a different host. So point being of this bit is that different harms are using different infrastructure in different ways. And different infrastructure and different layers of the internet are integral to that harm in different ways. So if we want to mitigate abuse, if we want to reduce harm on the internet, what are the attributes that that mitigation should have? Is it easy? Is it fast? Is it effective? Does it actually reduce the harm that we're trying to do? Does it mitigate the harm? Is it precise? Does it mitigate only that harm? Is that action proportional? So does it mitigate that harm in a way that doesn't affect a lot of other things, or is an appropriate response to that type of harm? For example, for the registry to take Twitter offline, the entire of Twitter, for a particular tweet would be not proportional, I would say. And so that leads me, and this is again where I'm sort of exploring these ideas of how to assess where to mitigate an online harm. And this is the bit that I'm really trying to think about myself and trying to encourage you guys to think about. So let's go back to that example of a death threat on Twitter, a nasty tweet. We can look at these different layers of the internet, these different bits of infrastructure, and apply those categories of those attributes we want mitigation to have, and figure out from there, I think, where the best place to address that harm might be. And I will say that I have ISP on here. There's such a diversity of ISPs in the world that there's basically no scenario where I think dealing with harmful stuff online is best at the ISP. Having said that, I think the UK does ISP level DNS blocking, but that's quickly being undermined by technologies like DNS over HTTPS, which is probably a whole other conversation we can get into. And I realize I've only got sort of 10 minutes here left, so we'll park that for the moment, see if we have time. So I'm not 100% sure about these green circles and red circles and question marks. I was just sort of dabbling with this over the weekend. And so I think there's room for discussion on some of these. That proportional thing I was talking about, taking twitter.com offline by the registry or registrar would be wildly disproportionate. It's also not precise in that you're taking all of the tweets offline rather than a very specific one. Are actions at the host or registry or registrar or platform effective? Yeah, that tweet is no longer visible if that's the harm you're trying to reduce. Fast is a really unknown, and I need to think more about whether this is an attribute that's worth discussing, because I really don't know how quick it would be to address this sort of harm in lots of these different places. I need to think about that one a bit more. Is it easy for a registry or registrar to mitigate that harm? Yeah, they could just turn off the domain name. That's not technically complicated. Addressing a nasty tweet at the ISP level is not easy, because you would need to get every single ISP in the world to try and block a specific tweet. Are they capable of that? I don't know. It would be very difficult to accomplish. But for the platform, for Twitter itself, to mitigate that harm, to delete or censor, for lack of a better word, a specific tweet, that's pretty easy for them. And so I think if you look at this grid, you can see that probably the place where that tweet is best mitigated is in the platform itself, is for Twitter to do something about it. That's where I think they have a responsibility to do things. If we look at our next example, that botnet CNC, and I apologize for slides bouncing around a little bit. So we know that the registry and the host are really the sort of integral pieces for a botnet to operate. And so we can see here there's no platform engaged. There's no Twitter or Reddit for this botnet to operate. The registries and registrars have a lot of room to do something here. The host and cloud does as well, but like I was saying to David's question in the chat, it's not typically very effective because they can switch their host relatively easily if they have all of these domain names registered, and that allows them to bounce around the internet very quickly. And so that's where, if you figured out the algorithm for these dynamically generated domain names, it's really more effective to operate at the registry level. And so mitigating a botnet at the host level is probably precise and proportional, but I don't know that it's going to be effective. And of course, there's probably some details in each individual examples of a botnet, which are going to add some subtlety to these sort of really broad categories. And that's a point I'm going to make in a sec. But what I'm trying to get at here is a framework for looking at harms online and deciding where the best place to mitigate them is. And where I get to in that is back to the definition of DNS abuse that the DNS Abuse Institute uses, which for the bit of the world that I'm concerned about, the DNS industry, registries and registrars, CCTLDs, that there's a finite number of harms online that are best addressed at the DNS, which is that they're efficient, they're effective, they're precise, and they're proportional. And so, that's how I get back to that definition. I think, however, there is a whole bunch more work to be done. I think we need to look at this analysis that I'm sort of doing here, this framework for addressing mitigation techniques, and we need to do them across all of these sort of categories of abuse. And that's work that I need to do as part of the Institute to sort of demonstrate to people why addressing some of these harms at the DNS level is inappropriate and why for others it is appropriate. And I will say that probably because there's so much gray area and each type of harm is unique, you could see very interesting quirks for each individual example, that having this as a framework might be useful in a lot of circumstances where a frontline abuse person might be looking at a type of abuse complaint that's come in and making this sort of assessment on each one. Ideally you get to a place where it's very quick and easy and you don't need to do an elaborate process because you want to be quick on these things. But I think it's maybe a useful tool. Sort of two related thoughts here that I think are important as well. One is that as I looked at that, created that map of the infrastructure of the internet, the only piece of that map that is centralized is the domain name system. All the rest of it is anarchic. There's no centralized governing body for ISPs, for content distribution networks, for hosting companies. Totally anarchic. You can start a new one any day. There's no one saying you can or cannot do that. There's no centralized regulation. The DNS, however, is unique in all of that internet infrastructure in that it's centralized. We have ICANN for GTLDs, and CCs tend to be a bit more anarchic, but you still know who the CCTLD provider is. You can identify them pretty easily. And so this means that people, where they're unable to contact or there's no regulation, run to the DNS a little bit quickly to try and resolve their harms. Where my argument is going to be that mitigating those harms at the DNS level might not meet those attributes. And there's probably a better place looking at those attributes to resolve those harms. And so I think DNS ends up checking that easy box quite a lot, but it's probably not proportional or precise in many circumstances. And those are things we need to assess. Now, it could be that we need to collectively do a bunch of work on the hosting industry, which is essentially unregulated, that hosts need to be more responsible with the content on their platforms, that they need to have SLAs for responding to abuse, that they need to ensure that things like malware and phishing get taken down in a timely fashion. How we go about doing that, I don't know, but it's worth having that conversation. The sort of last point I'll make here is around an idea called subsidiarity. This is an idea that comes up in Canadian federalism, for example, as well as the European Union. And the thought is basically this, that problems are best resolved at the lowest level of authority to that problem. So in government terms, it's typically you want your municipal government to solve most problems for the citizens. Like the closest possible government should solve those problems. Because the higher up you get in government, the more abstract the problems are between a citizen and the government. In internet infrastructure terms, the deeper in that infrastructure you get, the less precise and less proportional mitigating that harm might be. So, and I think about this a lot about the DNS, and going back to that harmful tweet example, using the DNS to resolve a harmful tweet really is like the opposite of capturing that idea of subsidiarity. You've gone about as far as possible in the internet infrastructure as you can to try and mitigate that harm. Really, the much better place to mitigate that harm is going to be on the platform. Much like mitigating many harms is going to be much better at the hosting company rather than the DNS. You really want to resolve that harm at the closest place to it, the place that's integral to that harm. And that's, I think, what I was trying to capture with those charts. And it's, I think, an important piece to keep in mind, or a guiding principle for as you're deciding how to mitigate harms online. I see we're at 10:44. I'm going to leave us on this slide. That was a whole bunch of content and a bunch of crazy ideas that I just threw at you. And I understand if that was a little opaque and a little dense. And I apologize for that. But, these are interesting and exciting ideas. So if you have more thoughts on those things, you should feel free to get in touch with me. My email address is there on the screen, or on Twitter. And I would encourage you to reach out on the dnsabuse.org, dnsabuseinstitute.org. We have a newsletter you can sign up for if you want to collaborate and engage on some of these topics some more. I've missed some stuff in the chat, but I will pause there and see if anybody has questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Graeme. This has been quite informative. Just a quick question. The DNS Abuse panel you had a couple of weeks ago with Ashley, Jeff, John, and Chris, is that a recording that's available? And number two is, do you plan another session fairly soon that you want to promote?
Great question. Thank you, Glenn. There is a recording. It goes up today. And so I will share that with you as soon as I get the link. It will be hosted on Circle ID, and there's a nice little blog post around it. But it's a good watch, so I would encourage people to check that out. I thought it was a pretty good panel. We are going to be doing another panel. I think at this point it's going to be early May. And that one, we want to discuss, similar to what I was talking about here today, the overlap of civil society issues and intellectual property issues with DNS abuse. To elaborate on that a little bit, if you were to graph a normal curve of DNS abuse, there's a boatload of it that's right in the middle. Just stock standard malware, botnets, farming, phishing. That's the bulk of the problem. We need to work on resolving that. But there are some really interesting things on the margins and those gray areas on the edge. And, intellectual property on one side is really interested in expanding our definition of abuse so that we will deal with intellectual property issues inside the DNS. I think civil society is concerned about the impacts of being overzealous on some of these issues on things like speech and access to the internet and people's rights. And those are worth being concerned about too. The Citizen Lab has done some really interesting work on how DNS abuse is weaponized against civil society actors too, and so that's an interesting topic. And so that conversation, stay tuned for when we announce it, is going to be about talking about those gray areas, those bits on the margins that I think are pretty thorny and pretty interesting and require some more discussion. I will say I don't think that's where the bulk of our work is going to be. I think we have a lot of work right in that thorny core of DNS abuse.
Great, thank you. Yeah, let me know when that recording is going to be available in your future sessions. You have a big job to take on, and it's no wonder that ICANN sort of avoided this issues for so long because, and again, their remit is fairly narrow. But I think we need to call out PIR and their willingness and capability to support in creation of the DNS abuse. And it's great that you've taken on this task, leaving Tucal. So kudos to all of you guys for taking this on. I'm just going to go turn to Kathy. Has been very active in her comments. Do you see her? Do you want to take a look at her chat? Do you want to touch on anything she said?
Let me scroll through that real quickly and make sure I haven't missed anything. I don't see any specific questions. If there's something specific, I mean, our concerns about civil society, I think, are reasonable. I think we talked about David's IPs and hosting. Bill had an interesting example about, I think that's a homoglyph attack, which is often used in phishing, and a real problem. And one of the things I think it would be really interesting to try and build tools that figure out if it's that sort of homoglyph attack or not, and then build that into the registration process. But I think it's going to be easier to report those after registration than try and get each registrar to write code that captures those on registration. Be my thinking on that.
So Graeme, this is Alfredo. Speaking from the end user standpoint of view, what type of education platform do you believe that the Institute will be able to build for us?
Don't know what that exactly is going to look like. I don't know that we'll, Glenn was sort of asking about this on the forum I hosted a week and a half ago about what that education component might look like. In my head right now, I wouldn't describe it as robust as a platform. I think it's going to be specific educational resources to start. And so that's going to be like best practice guidelines and like primers on different types of DNS abuse and how to mitigate it and how to recognize it. And so that is probably just a collection of like PDF resources or web resources, and less like a like what you're doing here, a set of classes or program to go through them. I think it'd be a really great idea to get there. As Glenn was saying, I've got a lot of work to do, and I think just producing those in the first place before we go about the work of turning that into something a little bit more robust, like a class, will be a while.
Yeah. So as a follow-up, Graeme, so in terms of what the Institute will be working on, and I know you have a lot of work before you, so I'm just trying to figure out or understand the harms category that you have. And I know it's a work in progress, but the way that I see it, there's a lot of sort of regulations involved or policies involved in terms of, and I know that you mentioned that it's going to be a voluntary thing to be on board with this and using the tools that you might develop or you might have available. But again, what's going to happen if we look at it from the GDPR point of view?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Okay, so basically, I'm trying to understand if there's an infringement that I report, but I am outside of the European community, for example. How will that help whatever organization to deal with the harm category or content abuse or something like that?
So I will say that the privacy aspect of domain registration information and where it overlaps with DNS abuse is a bit of a quagmire that I'm going to deliberately try and avoid. So, you know, I think access to registrant information where they are doing verifiable bad things is a place where there is room for some work. But the ICANN community is really spending a lot of time and resources on privacy issues right now, specific to the GDPR. And I just don't want to get stuck in that. I think I can do huge amounts of work to mitigate DNS abuse without having to really engage on that topic too much. But for your own example, I think anybody in theory should be able to submit a well-evidenced DNS abuse complaint for malware botnets, phishing, farming, and have a registry or registrar, wherever they are, look at it in good faith and try and act. To Bill's question in the chat about blocking easily confused stuff, it's really surprisingly difficult when you look at the volume of domain names registered. And having spent some time at a registrar with some 20 million names and looked at those registrations, people register domain names that are similar all the time, and often they are using like the Unicode characters or what have you in good faith. And so detecting them, I think, is or blocking them en masse is challenging. And I also think that the blocking of accents and stuff also disproportionately affects people not from Europe or North America, and so it's a problem to do that en masse as well. I think we want to encourage people to use, IDNs and different scripts and engage with the internet in their own language in their own ways. And I think you got to be really careful about how you would go about blocking accents and special characters. Is there a way to do it technically that flags them in the browser? Maybe. I haven't thought too much about that particular problem. What? Oh, I think I missed something from Kathy. Maybe do we think a third party will monitor or report? Is this the Institute's role? So we want to build tools for people to report DNS abuse as they find it and ensure that they're able to capture the information they need to do that. ICANN does some measurement of DNS abuse already in something called the Domain Abuse Activity Reporting System, DAR. It's okay. They've done a pretty good job with it, but they're limited in what they can accomplish because of, I think, contractual issues. I'm looking at whether we can build our own abuse reporting because I think we'll have a bit more freedom to do that and be able to illuminate some darker corners a little bit easier. And so that's a thing on my list that I would like to look at doing, but it's a tricky problem. Yeah, the overtime trend is sort of what I'm reporting to, Kathy, where I want to be able to say this is what abuse has looked like over time and here's how it's trending. And part of that is very selfish. I want to be able to show that I'm doing a really good job. But I think it also makes the internet better. I think we need to be able to show that there's movement, that people are voluntarily doing great things, and that as we build better tools, they're able to combat these issues. There's maybe a last point here too that gets missed a little bit as we sort of focus on registries and registrars and what they're doing or not doing. And that is on the other side of abuse online and online harms, not necessarily just DNS abuse, but the people doing bad things on the internet, malware, phishing, etc. It's not just like lone wolf actors in their basement being jerks. It's an industry. There are people who make hundreds of millions of dollars doing this. They have immense amounts of resources. They recruit the best talent that they can. And so to approach this problem sort of individually as like a lone registrar or something like that, you're just never going to win. These people have more money than you. They have more resources than you. They're going to find out better ways to exploit your systems. And that's one of the reasons why the Institute, I think, can play a big role, is that bringing all these people together, consolidating this information, we've got a better shot at mitigating these harms from these like coordinated, well-funded people who do bad things. Do I see anything else in the chat?
I don't see any more questions, Graeme, in the chat. So this is the last call for any questions before we end the session. We're about 1 minute to the top of the hour. So I'm going to take the opportunity to thank you, Graeme, and the interesting conversation that we've sustained, and invite everybody to watch the same topic covered in Group A's and B's on DNS abuse. Bill was an integral part of previous discussions, and some of you as well from your point of view. Glenn?
No, that's great. Thank you so much, Graeme. This is this is a follow-up. We had Brian Chabolik from PIR, previous group. We have that recording available. Your session will be fantastic to be added to this collection of recordings. And then if you could share with us the panel, and we'll keep all our students involved because they'll be part of our alumni. Happy to have you, and I hope you can come back again, and perhaps we can do a panel. So again, this is one of our goals, is to educate. We can't cover everything in this material, but I think you did a great job. And to give you feedback, I know it was an experiment for you, but I think you did really well. Thank you so much.
Thanks, man. Really appreciate it. Thanks, everybody, for your time. And again, feel free to reach out if you've got questions or comments. You know, the more input, the better, as I build this thing to make the internet safer for everyone.
Well, thank you, Graeme, and we'll end this session now. Thank you.
Thank you.